Welcome to the Fun Astrology Saturday Financial Forecast. I'm Thomas Miller. This week's article, of course published on MMAcycles.com, is guest authored by Gianni Di Poce. We always enjoy his thoughts of the week and look ahead. Let's jump right in. First of all, an article from May 28th, CNBC.com. A federal trade court struck down President Donald Trump's worldwide reciprocal tariffs and ordered the administration to stop collecting them. Now, Gianni's week in review. U.S. stocks kicked off the shortened trading week due to the Memorial Day holiday on a strong note, exploding higher on Tuesday. But from Wednesday to Friday, we saw nothing but choppy sideways price action. Even so, the Nasdaq led the way higher last week and still finished near its highs. The tech sector's rebound has been critical to recovery in the U.S. markets, and that continued last week. European markets were also higher last week, with the German DAX hitting yet another new all-time high. In fact, Europe is home to the best-performing international market year-to-date, in Poland. The AEX was up but off its highs of the week, while the FTSE is still consolidating just under its all-time high and finished near its highs of the week. In the Pacific Rim, the Hang Seng Index finished down on the week. The Australian ASX saw a solid rally, but it paled in comparison to the Nikkei's rally, which led the way higher in Asia last week. The Shanghai Composite was virtually unchanged. Both gold and silver closed slightly lower last week as some cyclical risks continue to mount in that sector. The question, of course, is whether Jupiter in Cancer will be a tailwind for silver prices superficially. Cryptocurrencies finished mixed. Bitcoin finally paused its rally and closed lower on the week, while Ethereum continued its rally and hit a new cycle high. Ethereum's technical situation continues to improve with each passing week. In commodity markets, the selling continued. Crude oil and all grain markets finished lower. This is not the type of price action that we would be seeing if inflation was on the rise. Instead, it looks like another break to new multi-year lows could be around the corner. Treasury markets saw a nice rebound and are building the case for a bottom being complete, despite concerns from the bond vigilantes. The dollar finished up on the week, but more against the yen than the euro. Now the short-term geocosmics. What's coming up? Well, this week it's all about Venus. It's been a long journey for the planet of money, beauty, and art to make it to her ruling sign of Taurus. That was because of the retrograde motion earlier this year. But if anything, 2025 has been a reminder of the importance of this planet for financial markets, given how the April 7th low occurred less than a week before the retrograde period ended. Through our studies here at MMA, it's been found that Venus in Taurus is especially key for Bitcoin. The transit has been shown to correspond to 20% or greater moves in the price of Bitcoin. The ingress occurs June 6th, and Venus will remain in her ruling sign until July 4th. Now, this doesn't automatically mean a rally in Bitcoin is going to continue. That's not how geocosmics work. The 20% could go either way. Nonetheless, we're in the early stages of a new intermediate-term cycle in Bitcoin and probably in the final phase of an even longer-term cycle. And what do we know about the final phases? Well, they can go parabolic if, number one, they close significantly higher than the primary prior cycle, or two, if they exceed a normal mid-pause price target. We cover that in our MMA weekly subscription reports. If we end up seeing a 20% or greater move to the upside during Venus in Taurus, it could kickstart the cryptomania that would seemingly be needed to correspond to a long-term cycle crest, perhaps as soon as this fall. Just a few days after Venus ingresses into Taurus, we have Jupiter moving into his sign of exaltation, Cancer, on June 9th. Venus will square Pluto on the same day. With the whole tariff situation in disarray now, it's entirely possible that the Fed will begin to moderate its stance on the inflationary front. Jupiter, a planet of stimulus, transiting Cancer, supports the idea of economic expansion. There are tax cuts coming down the pipeline from Congress, and with the recent tariff news, it seems that the market previously priced in a scenario that was much worse than it really is. Then there's Pluto, which rules the 4 Ds: debt, default, deficit, and downgrades. We just had a federal debt downgrade recently, and the new federal budget is only going to increase the federal deficit and increase the national debt. It's the same old story, but guess what? Markets tend to like it. But Pluto also rules interest rates. It's no secret that there's been tensions between President Trump and Jerome Powell over at the Fed. I've even remarked previously how Pluto's eventual transit over the Fed's natal Uranus at 5 degrees of Aquarius could lead to an attempted takeover by the current administration of the central bank. In the near future, I'd watch out for a rhetoric shift from the central bank on the potential for rate cuts. Powell and Trump met together at the White House this past week for the first time since 2019. It doesn't seem like the June 18th meeting will correspond to a rate cut at the moment. Perhaps the July 30th one will, although the odds are slim. But that can change quickly, especially if next week's job report shows any signs of weakness. There are more and more reports surfacing that artificial intelligence is replacing jobs, and it would be wise for the Fed to try to stay ahead of the curve. Fortunately, last week's inflation data showed that inflation is not accelerating, not in the slightest bit. This is likely to remain the case so long as crude oil prices remain subdued. And now this week's longer-term thoughts and opinion from Gianni Di Poce. An article from Wednesday's CNBC.com, participants noted that the committee might face difficult trade-offs if inflation proves to be more persistent while the outlooks for growth and employment weaken. Last weekend, we had Saturn join Neptune in the sign of Aries. The two planets are now a little more than a degree apart, and while the exact conjunction won't take place until February 2026, the close proximity of these two outer planets means that we're getting a preview of what's to come in 2026 and beyond. This is because both Saturn and Neptune will retrograde back into Pisces later this year, on September 1st and October 22nd, respectively. The definitive ingress for Saturn into Aries takes place in February 2026, while the definitive ingress for Neptune into Aries takes place in January 2026. Saturn spends about 2.5 years in each sign, while Neptune spends about 15 years in each sign. Saturn in Pisces corresponded with an absolute bloodbath in the energy and healthcare sectors, while Neptune in Pisces marked an era of luxury beliefs and the rewarding of individuals for parroting ideas that have little to no basis in reality. As crazy as it sounds, we may eventually end up looking back at the period between 2011 and 2026 as the good old days, at some point in the future. Such is the nature of Neptune. Things are never as good or as bad as they seem. But in the meantime, let's discuss this potent synodic cycle that lasts approximately 36 years. The last time this occurred was in 1989, when the Berlin Wall fell. The time before that was 1953, which marked the end of the Korean War and the death of Stalin. Before that, there was the conjunction of 1917, which occurred a little more than a year before World War I ended and coincided with the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. This certainly provides a reason to be optimistic on the geopolitical front, given the ongoing conflicts in Ukraine and the Middle East, to name a couple. But the catch here is the conjunction is in Aries, a sign of war and aggressiveness. Saturn conjunct Neptune can easily mean the dissolving of barriers. But what kind of barriers? Will it be barriers to war, or potentially even barriers to trade? It may even have something to do with NATO, which has an Aries stellium. Mercury, Venus, Mars, and the Sun are all conjunct between 6 and 14 degrees in this sign. We know there's been pressure for funding reforms in this military organization. Let's consider some economic factors in play here, too. The conjunction between Saturn and Neptune will take place right on the Federal Reserve's midheaven, right at 0 degrees of Aries. The Fed has been facing a tremendous amount of pressure from President Trump to cut interest rates. Their hesitation has centered around inflationary impacts from tariffs. But now that those don't seem to be as significant of a factor as before, what's left to stop them? We know from history that Neptune in fire signs tends to be inflationary, but we may have a Goldilocks scenario on our hands whereby the Fed could get away with cutting rates without reigniting inflation, at least at first. Saturn is a planet that's often associated with deflation and lower prices. This means that we could look for the Fed to lower rates without creating much inflation until Saturn starts to separate meaningfully from Neptune next year. In essence, Saturn would, quote-unquote, restrict the inflationary nature of Neptune while the two planets are close together. The catch, of course, is that Saturn is in its fall in Aries, so we must be prepared for its deflationary forces to be weaker than normal. In this scenario of low to moderate inflation, stocks should perform exceptionally well. This fits with the idea that a significant cyclical reset just took place in April, too. Bonds, which have faced notable headwinds, may also see some relief, but in the near term, we're faced with two distinct long-term cycle scenarios. Either way, a decline of the interest rate front is supported by both cycles and geocosmics in 2026. Enjoy it while it lasts, because once the tide of Neptune turns, there's no stopping the wave of rising prices. Fortunately, we have geocosmics to guide us along the way. But make no mistake, the time to prepare is now. Remember, Saturn is involved too, so diligence and responsibility will be rewarded. What a perfect way to conclude this week's newsletter. Be sure to check out the weekly video on the Fun Astrology YouTube channel. It came out on Friday, kind of a combination of Friday and Sunday. And Kristin and I will be back with a full week of podcasts next week. Thanks so much for listening. Have a great rest of the weekend.